Peanuts, and welcome to anyone who is new to this channel or to my podcast. Now, this podcast covers true crime cases that may not be suitable for young listeners. Listener and viewer discretion is advised. So, welcome back, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed my last couple of episodes on Barbie and Ken murders and Eileen Wuornos. Today, we've got the lovely Charlotte featuring again. This little angel decided that she wanted to eat some raspberry licorice, which led to a very urgent visit to the vet because her belly was very, very sore and she's on the road to recovery. But for anyone who has pets, no to licorice. Very, 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 very bad for them. So this is my third episode that's going to be dedicated to one of the most important people in my life. This one is for you, Auntie Sparrow. Thank you for everything you do in my life. There is not a childhood memory that does not feature you. There is just so many memories that I can't even count. And thank you for being you. Thank you for being my mum's best friend. And just thank you for being really wonderful. You've been really, really wonderful in my life. And I don't know what I would do without you. So thank you so much. You said to pick anything for this episode. So guys, we're going to go back to our regular viewing pleasure and we are going to go back to serial killers. So this time we are going to be doing the state of Maryland. Now, I have never, ever, ever been to Maryland. So this is going to be an interesting one for me, guys, but I think it would be pretty darn fabulous if I'm going to be perfectly honest. And look at this. She is already demanding pats. She doesn't even know how to be a naughty, sensible little beagle. So I do apologize. So in the Maryland suburbs, we've got two families that would be 6 years apart that would be devastated by the sudden disappearance of the death of a child and a young woman. Now, the man at the center of both these cases would be a gentleman by the name of Hadden Clark. Now, he's been called many things over the years: a drifter, a cook, a gardener, and convicted murder. Today, we're going to trace his arc from his turbulent early life to the investigations that finally brought some answers, the courtroom outcomes, and now where we sit today. Now, Hadden Clark, he was born on June 1st in 1952 in Troy, New York, into a family that you can only really describe as really, really deeply dysfunctional. His parents' marriage was marred with alcohol abuse and volatility, abuse. Neighbours, relatives, they would recall all of the frequent screaming matches. The children would often witness scenes of chaos that left some pretty lasting scars. These are things, though, we're talking about so many times, guys, right? The childhoods of a lot of these serial killers, they're really marred with a lot of violence and a lot of trauma. There is an absolutely fabulous documentary called The Serial Killer and the Savior. His brother, Jeffrey, actually is featured in it, and he heavily goes into exactly what their childhoods were like, and it gives you a real insight. It also features the confessions. It features an interview with Haddon. It's really, really interesting. So if you do want to learn a little bit more about him and just sort of some of his strange and odd sort of behavior that began pretty early, and there was some stuff that his mother did to him that was just, go and watch it. If you get an opportunity, go and watch it. It's on HBO Max in Australia and also Foxtel. I couldn't tell you what it is in the States or any other country, but it's HBO Max. I am just going to open up my drink and we'll start again. So this one today, guys, is Solo Energy. This one's zero sugar. I'm doing a fabulous job at keeping me awake because I haven't slept that well because of Charlotte not being well this week. Now, from an early age, he really stood out, not really for achievements, unfortunately, but more around his odd behavior that would often, it drew a lot of ridicule. Family members later testified that he was bullied by his siblings and sometimes quite cruelly. One that surfaces repeatedly when he would play with dolls or dressed in his mother's clothes, his brothers would mock him relentlessly. Now, these humiliations weren't isolated. They would just become a part of his daily sort of reality. School offered him very little refuge. Teachers described him as quiet, withdrawn, and prone to daydreaming. Classmates would remember him as the weird kid. He just didn't quite fit in. He was often the target of playground taunts, which only deepened his sense of real alienation as such. And later psychological evaluations, they would note that these early experiences of rejection would definitely contribute to his fragile sort of self-image and his social detachment. Now, despite all of his turmoil, he developed a real fascination with cooking and the outdoors. He could spend hours experimenting in the kitchen and wandering through wooded areas near his home. These interests would definitely later sort of shape his adult life as such, first as a trained chef, then as a gardener, and even these passions couldn't mask some of that instability and sort of that drive in life to torture and torment. It's by his late teens that some troubling signs start to emerge. Relatives would recall them as what they would describe as episodes of anger. They're outbursts that didn't really fit the situation. He often displayed impulsive behaviour. Sometimes he would harm animals, a detail which would later alarm investigators when they were reviewing his psychological profile. It's one of that Macdonald triad. These behaviours combining with his growing isolation, it starts to hint that he's got those deeper issues that we've talked about with other serial killers. It's after high school, he would enroll in culinary school, and later he would join the US Navy as a cook. But his military career, ironically, would end really, really abruptly in 1985 when he was discharged with psychiatric reasons. He was diagnosed apparently with paranoid schizophrenia. Court records and psychiatric reports would confirm this. They would note symptoms like delusional thinking and social paranoia. Now, this diagnosis would become central in sort of understanding what he did later, and it would definitely be a part of the legal strategy from his defense in the trial. It's by the mid-1980s, his life is really unraveling. He's drifted between short-term jobs, family couches, cheap rentals. He's leaving behind unpaid bills. He's got some pretty fractured relationships with his family and friends. His family ties are strained basically to the breaking point. It's really in hindsight, right, that these patterns rooted in his childhood instability, compounded by his untreated mental illness, it would form some of that backdrop of the violent crimes that we're about to talk about and see. Beneath that surface, something dark was definitely brewing, and something that ends up claiming two really innocent lives and would haunt a lot of investigators for more than a decade. Now, I might add, in this period of time, it's his brother who also kills a work colleague and performs the act of cannibalism. So I believe he's got 4 siblings, I believe. He's one of 4, and it's only one of his siblings, and that's his sister, that is not in jail. The rest of them at all one point in time, Hadden, I think it is Hadden Clark, his brother, the one that killed his work colleague and performed acts of cannibalism, I believe he is still in jail. I think the other 2 are not, but there's a lot of violence that stems from this family. So it's not, I don't want to use the word normal because I really despise that word, but his family was marred with a lot of violence, and it's all this. A lot of his siblings learnt that men were meant to be the rulers, and being that a form of his punishment. Now, it's not quite clear whether it was his mother who would dress him up in clothes as a form of punishment or hadn't actually enjoyed it. In the documentary, his brother actually says he enjoyed it and this is what he wanted. In another couple of articles, it's saying it's sort of leaning towards that his mum did this as a form of punishment. So I'm not really sure. I think a little bit of column A and a little bit of column B. We're going to get into the victims next, so let's get to there. So it was May 31 in 1986, Memorial Day weekend, Silver Spring, Maryland. 6-year-old Michelle Dorr, she was playing outside when she just vanishes without a trace. Her father had she'd been just dropped off, and within hours, police would launch into a massive search. Neighbours would comb the areas, but Michelle was completely gone. Now, it's early on in this investigation that detectives would interview Hadden Clark. He lived 2 doors down, and he's known to the family because he's living in his brother's home at the moment, and one of his nieces actually plays with Michelle. So she actually knows who he is. She knows that sort of home. He would end up giving a statement but with no physical evidence tying him to her disappearance, it goes really cold really quickly. Now, for the years, her parents would live in limbo and they would actually cling to the hope that she would be alive. It was really unfortunate, though. Her father, Carl, was actually a prime suspect for years, went through some pretty big and hellish times during this time, being the main suspect because she was at his house. And the worst possible thing is when Haddon was on trial, they tried to blame the father again as a defense strategy. So you're rubbing so much salt into this wound of this father who's just lost his daughter and just keep accusing him. From all the articles that I read, it was actually pretty devastating. Now, what no one knows, right, is Haddon had already killed her. It was later court records and his own admissions that would reveal the chilling details, how he would lure Michelle, he would actually conceal her body in a wooded ravine off Route 29, and how he carried out what he'd done was a secret for more than a decade. Fast forward to October 9th, Bethesda, Maryland. Bethesda, I think it's pronounced, 23-year-old Laura Houghtelling, a recent Harvard graduate, failed to show up for work. Now, friends and family knew this was really out of character. So when police searched her home, they found a pillowcase with a bloody fingerprint and a clue that would actually break the case wide open and lead to Michelle's death being known. It's investigators that quickly zeroed in on Hadden Clark, who'd been working as a gardener for Laura's mother. He had access to the house and he'd been seen around the neighbourhood around the time of her disappearance. So when he is questioned, he's spinning a bunch of lies, but the forensic evidence would actually tell another story. The fingerprint matched his. 8 months later, after a plea deal, Hadden Clark led authorities to a shallow grave in a wooded area where they would find her body. Now, the discovery confirmed what the family had feared and what investigators suspected. She'd been murdered in her own home, and then she'd been taken away and buried by someone that they actually trusted and led into their home. Both victims were young, they're vulnerable, and they're connected to Haddon through proximity and trust. Now, in Michelle's case, he was a neighbour. In Laura's, he's an employee. Now, these weren't random attacks. They're crimes of opportunity. They're committed, again, by someone hiding in plain sight. Later searches of his belongings turned up some trophies. There would be jewellery, there'd be personal items. There would even be Laura's class ring, which, let's be clear, sometimes this is actually a compulsion that the serial killers use to relive crimes. So it's pretty clear that this type of behaviour is definitely what serial killers do. Now, stepping back from some of these timelines, there's several behavioural patterns that stand out in his crimes. Now, these observations, for one, they don't excuse any of his actions, guys. They just give us some understanding on how he operated and why certain investigative steps would ultimately really work. Both victims were picked because of the proximity to him. One was a nearby neighbour, that's Michelle, and the other one is the employee's daughter, that's Laura. That pattern, that would be targeting within a known radius. That often reflects like opportunity to be a predator rather than a broad geographic hunting range. Someone like Ted Bundy, right? So it also suggests a belief that access and familiarity would sort of lower that suspicion. So although he's frequently described as a transient, he's unstable, he's exhibited some type of planning, because in the 1992 case, investigators documented post-crime transport and burial and later recovered scene-level forensics like a pillowcase with fingerprint that linked him back to the home. These details indicate that ability to plan and improvise in the moment. Even if the plan was flawed, he improvised in that moment. They would say that he used a wig and women's clothing to create the impression Laura had left the house alive at some point. So there's a staging thing. So it's a tactic that would misdirect the timeline. It would buy time to, clean and distance himself from the area. It's not unusual, but they're worried about being detected. So it's that fear that kicks in. Now, the later we're discovering those trophies like the keepsakes, it sort of really aligns with that type of behavior. It's retaining souvenirs to revisit the crime psychologically. Souvenirs are typically personal items rather than risky trophies like weapons. It's more they want something personal of the victim so that they can relive what they did, which is absolutely disgusting as far as I'm concerned. But it does happen a lot. Now, in Laura's case, he would repeatedly send a sympathy card to the family after the murder. That kind of sort of insertion would seek sort of wanting to know a little bit of gratification. How close can I get without being caught? Or is it to find out more about where they are with the crime? So it's not unusual. It's definitely something that we've seen before. Now, this is something I've really hinted at before about these gaps in between, cooling off periods in between murders. There's quite a big gap in this one. There's 6 years. So just 1 second, guys. I am just going to take a sip of my drink. So he had a cooling off period between the period of like 1986 and 1992. Now, this has often been about job shifting, incarceration, homelessness. It can even be the fact that they've gotten married and they've gotten kids and all that kind of stuff. So it doesn't reduce the risk. It just complicates that sort of detection. So I suspect that he was either getting his gratification somewhere else or potentially there are more victims. I'm not going to go into too much detail with potential victims. I might hint at it, but if you want to, go and watch the documentary because it does give a little bit more. But again, it is strange that there is a massive cooling off period. So he's also got paranoid schizophrenia. So 2 things about this. His psychosis may distort the type of thinking, yet the legal sort of ramifications and the planning and the attempts to sort of avoid capture. Most people who are schizophrenic are not violent. Criminal responsibility is it falls in that weird space. Courts have definitely evaluated the facts and secured convictions on that basis, but it's always a bit strange to me because I do suspect that some of it played a part in his... I think there is a part that it played in the murders, but also paranoid schizophrenics, if they're on their medication, they're actually functioning adults. So it just depends, at least in my opinion. Now, Haddon would later claim he's done additional murders, including a long publicised 1974 Cape Cod case. It was called Lady of the Dunes. The victim has since been identified as Ruth Terry. Authorities have named a different perpetrator in 2023, which sort of it puts a bit of a spanner in the works. There is some potential there, though. So the case pairs how small, it's always a really, really strange one. If you go and investigate it for yourself, I'm not entirely sure he's not guilty. So when Laura Houghtelling vanished in October 1992, the search began as a missing persons case. But within hours, there's subtle hints and clues that hinted at something far worse. Inside her bedroom, there's faint reddish stains. They didn't want to confirm whether it was blood, but forensic testing would confirm that later, and that fingerprint would emerge, would end up matching him. And it's this single piece of evidence, though, that transformed the case from a disappearance into a homicide investigation. He is questioned repeatedly. His stories would shift, first claiming ignorance, then offering implausible sort of explanations. Detectives learned that he borrowed a car the day that Laura disappeared and he'd been seen near the home. They also discovered that he had a history of theft and mental health issues, which sort of added more urgency to the investigation. Facing more and more evidence, though, Haddon ended up pleading guilty to second-degree murder in Laura's case. Months later, he would lead investigators to a shallow grave in a wooded area where her remains would be recovered. Now, it's this discovery that would provide closure for her family and validated all of that forensic sort of evidence that had begun with just that single fingerprint. Now, while he's serving time for Laura's murder, though, he would make some pretty cryptic statements about other murders. Detectives revisited the 1986 disappearance of Michelle Dorr. Now, they re-examined old witnesses' statements, cross-referenced Haddon's movements, and built a circumstantial case strong enough to charge him, even without a body. Now, it's in October 1999 that a jury would convict him of the second-degree murder in Michelle's case. Then came a massive breakthrough. In January 2000, he actually led them to a wooded ravine where Michelle's remains were found, 13 years after she'd vanished. Now, this discovery not only confirmed the conviction, but also underscored the persistence of investigators who refused to let this one go down in history. Now, during follow-up searches, authorities would once again find keepsakes. It's always a really, really interesting component, but two trials, which are 6 years apart, would finally lock in his fate. Each case would tell a different story, though, but together they formed, well, I guess, a chilling pattern of accountability. And it's always really hard because he definitely didn't want to admit or confess. And it's all of these things that when he does this and he confesses to all these crimes, that he allows those family members to actually get, some closure. He's an interesting one because when you see him later in interviews and all those kind of components, it's always really, really strange for me because he almost seems ridiculously calm. The way he talks about it, he is so unemotional. He's so factual in some of his language, and it was scary. It was really eerie to watch him talk about it with just the magnitude of what he had done, because he commits cannibalism like his brother. I'm not going to get into too much detail because I do think that no one really needs to know what happened to those victims in their dying moments I just don't need to give it some airtime. So he was given a 30-year sentence for the murder of Laura. And then when he was taken to court over Michelle Dorr, he's handed down another 30-year sentence. So concurrently, he has to serve 60 years, basically. Now, he would appeal challenging evidence and witness testimony. But it's in 2001 that the Maryland's Court of Special Appeals upheld that conviction. So add it all up, we've got 30 years for Laura, 30 years for Michelle, plus 10 years relating to a theft case. That's 70 years in total. He's got no chance of freedom, to be clear, guys. In the courtroom, though, the story was clear. A fingerprint, a confession, and two families finally had answers. Justice didn't come quickly for Michelle's family, but it did come. It's really, really sad for her dad, of what he had to endure. Now, when the verdicts were in, the sentences were read, the courtroom went, it sort of went really quiet. The aftermath of how it all went down, what he claimed, it left a very bitter pill for a lot of people to swallow because they were just trying to make sense of this man that they knew. Now, recent coverage tied to a new documentary, the one I talked about, documentary work, has noted that he is parole eligible under the Maryland rules. Eligibility, of course, though, is not the same as release. It's the procedural milestone that doesn't change the facts that have already been established. He's claiming over the years, he weans in and out of this one, right? He claims additional murders. I think that when it gets investigated, though, it collapses really quickly because it's just there's no evidence to that. In 2022, when it came out about Ruth Terry, that it was tied to a different perpetrator, he keeps wanting to claim it. So I don't know. I think because these investigators, they're following facts rather than stories, they're definitely getting to the bottom of Haddon. And does Haddon just want to claim those things because of the fact that it gives him some sort of purpose in life? Is that what he wants? Is that what he sees as something that gives him some notoriety and allows him to be better than everybody else. We've certainly seen that with serial killers. They like to say, hey, I've killed up to 100 people, but, there's evidence of only like 5 to 10. Henry Lee Lucas, he loved all of that attention that he got. Ted Bundy absolutely adored it, like when they came and interviewed him and all that kind of stuff. So it's always one of those things. These guys, they're very big. They're very, hey, look at me. So it's always very interesting onto how many victims they actually have. We do have obviously, it's called the documentary Born Evil, the Serial Killer and the Savior. This would retell all of those stories. It draws new attention. But again, it's it gives them a platform to be, I don't know how to describe this. It puts them up on a platform, like very similar to giving them names and all that kind of stuff. So it's all of those things that even me having a podcast talking about serial killers, I'm giving them another platform. So I am trying to change that narrative and talk about the victims. And, if there's a lesson for anything out of these podcasts, it's the importance of naming the victims, right? So Laura Houghtelling and Michelle Dorr, they're the headlines to remember more than Hadden Clark himself. Like, I like analysing him and all that kind of stuff, but this episode, I do want to remember them. From all of this, remember who they are. Remember their names. Remember Laura. Remember Michelle. But on a side note, right, while serving time, Hadden Clark's mental health struggles became really, really visible. At one point, he reportedly believed his cellmate was Jesus Christ. So according to court records and interviews, he claimed that his cellmate gave him divine instructions and even encouraged him to confess to additional murders. Now, these statements were later viewed with skepticism by investigators, especially because of his so-called revelations lacking in corroborating evidence. It does demonstrate his paranoid schizophrenia diagnosis and his delusional thinking. So it complicated that line between fact and fantasy because of all these jailhouse claims, right? So it's one of those interesting ones that you do sort of have to really, is it his delusional thinking that is making him think that he's murdered more people than potentially he has actually murdered more people? Now, guys, thank you so much for joining us on my episode from Crimes from the Peanut Gallery. If you found this story as chilling as we did, please subscribe, hit that like button on the episode, leave me a comment. Stay tuned for our next episode where we delve into another dark and twisted tale of a serial killer. Until then, stay safe and be vigilant. Have a great weekend, my fellow peanuts. See you later, guys. All done, babe.